Have you ever, like, wish there was a way to just get right to the heart of what a philosopher was all about? Like, especially one who dealt with logic, but also, how we think in everyday life. That's what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into the work of Susan Stebbing.
Yeah, Susan Stebbing, really important figure in British analytic philosophy, between World War I and World War II. She did a lot, in logic, shaping analytic philosophy itself, and what's maybe most interesting, trying to apply logic to real-world problems. And we're mostly using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on her for this. Really thorough stuff.
You got it. And remember how you wanted to understand Stebbing's, lasting impact? That's what we're after. To kind of unpack her main ideas and show why connecting those abstract philosophical concepts to practical concerns is still relevant for philosophers today.
Okay, so let's start with Stebbing's life. She was born Lizzie Susan Stebbing in North London back in 1885. Later, everybody just knew her as Susan. I mean, think about it. She lived through some pretty major changes, socially and, of course, philosophically. It's interesting. Her family actually tried to steer her away from science. They thought she was too delicate health-wise. So she ended up studying history at Girton College, Cambridge.
It's crazy how, those early things can kind of shape a philosopher's path, But even with that start, she got really into philosophy after reading F.H. Bradley's Appearance in Reality. Oh, and we should probably mention she had Meniere's disease her whole life. Pretty awful, with vertigo and headaches and all that.
And yet, even with all that, she had an amazing academic career. Got a lectureship at Bedford College in 1920, and then, get this, in 1933, she became the first woman in the UK to be a full professor of philosophy. At Bedford College again, actually. A huge deal for women in academia, and, a real testament to how brilliant she was.
Total pioneer for sure. The entry also talks about how she interacted with so many big names in philosophy at the time and how much she did to help refugees escape from Nazi Germany. Really shows you how, tough philosophical work can go with a deep concern for what's going on in the world. Sadly, she died young, in 1943, only 57 years old.
Oh, one more thing for anyone who's going through her work. She published as L.S. Stebbing. Kind of strange, right? But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions that a friend thought she did that on purpose, so people would focus on the arguments, not whether a man or a woman was making them. Shows you the challenges women faced back then.
Right. Let's get into her philosophical stuff. Starting with logic. She really made a big impact there. Her book from 1930, A Modern Introduction to Logic, is seen as a super important text. I mean, for philosophers, it's pretty much considered the first real textbook on analytic philosophy. What made it so influential?
That's the key question, right? It wasn't just that it was an analytic textbook. It was the scope, how ambitious it was. Stebbing, she actually brought together that traditional Aristotelian logic with the, newer mathematical logic from Russell and Whitehead. Imagine a bridge between centuries of thought on logic. She presented them both, all rigorous, so readers could see how logic developed and where it was going, all in one book. A groundbreaking move that set the standard for every logic textbook after that.
She didn't see logic as just abstract systems either. Famously, she said logic is directed thinking, like a tool to solve problems through, systematic reasoning. This idea of applying logic is something you see throughout her work.
Absolutely. She emphasized how important it is to, first of all, clearly identify your premises. That's where you start, and then you stick to valid argumentation to reach conclusions that, actually hold up. Her whole treatment of syllogistic theory, it wasn't just a history lesson. It showed how the structure, the logical form, makes an inference valid no matter what specific content you're dealing with.
And she did introduce the symbols from Principia Mathematica and, the theory of relations. But she didn't do a full system of predicate calculus. Any idea why?
Probably because of, her teaching goals. She was focused on making sure people really understood the basic concepts, the principles of logic, both the traditional and modern kinds. Giving the reader the tools to grasp how validity works and the power of formal systems. Not just a tech manual on the newest stuff. She was building the foundation for philosophy to engage with logic.
Makes sense. She was into the, philosophical meaning and how you could use it. This focus on practical application is really clear in her 1934 book, Logic and Practice. She's aiming for a wider audience here, right? Talking about the art of thinking, how language is so crucial for both good and bad reasoning. This book is all about, what we call critical thinking skills these days.
Totally. Logic and practice wasn't just about formal rules. It went into how our minds work, the linguistic stuff that can mess us up when we reason. She analyzed common fallacies, biases in how we talk every day, showing how even a little bit of logical understanding could help people become better thinkers, less likely to be tricked. This was her taking philosophical ideas and applying them to real-life problems.
This whole shift towards practical application and critical thinking seems like it was really shaped by her involvement with the Cambridge School of Analysis. The entry mentions her, like conversion to analytic philosophy. Happened after a pretty intense meeting with G.E. Moore back in 1917. Sounds like a major philosophical moment. What went down?
Oh, it was a turning point for her. At a meeting of the Aristotelian Society, Moore, well, he just grilled her, questioned her arguments relentlessly. This wasn't about, winning a debate. He wanted absolute clarity to uncover any hidden assumptions or contradictions. This made Stebbing see flaws in her own thinking, and from then on, she changed her whole approach to philosophy. Their relationship, with ongoing discussions and letters in Cambridge was clearly a big part of how she became an analytic philosopher. She even revised a chapter in the second edition of A Modern Introduction to Logic because of Moore's criticisms.
One key idea she took from Moore was the difference between understanding a proposition and knowing its analysis. This is fundamental to the Cambridge School, right? Could you explain that a bit for people who aren't, super familiar with it?
Sure thing. Moore's argument was that we can get what a proposition means, even know it's true, just from common sense. Things like, I'm talking right now, or there's a table in front of me. But to give a full philosophical analysis of what those simple statements really mean, breaking them down, seeing how they relate to reality, that's a whole other ballgame. This shows how much analytic philosophers wanted to make even obvious truths super clear. It's interesting, this idea is also in Wittgenstein's early work, in the Tractatus, show they were on similar wavelengths back then.
In her 1932 paper, The Method of Analysis in Metaphysics, Stebbing tried to, lay out the assumptions behind this Cambridge School analysis. She found three. The first one, if I remember right, was that to analyze a proposition, you got to understand it first, meaning it needs to be expressed clearly.
Exactly. The second one was that for a proposition to be analyzed, it has to be possible for it to be true, and sometimes we know it is true. This fits perfectly with Moore's idea that common sense knowledge is a good starting point for philosophy. Stebbing thought this assumption was pretty reasonable.
The third assumption, directional analysis, that's the one that caused problems for her. What did it mean, and why didn't she like it?
So, directional analysis was the idea that when you analyze something, you should aim for and eventually get to basic facts. These were the simplest possible facts, the smallest units of reality. This idea was important for early Wittgenstein and Russell too. They wanted to base all knowledge on solid, fundamental truths. But Stebbing, after really thinking about it, she decided it wasn't really justified, and it didn't seem very plausible either. She questioned the whole idea that we could even reach these ultimate, indivisible facts.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry uses a good example. The proposition, every economist is fallible. It shows how a logical analysis would rephrase this using, formal logic stuff to make the structure clear. But metaphysical analysis, if it tries to break it down into tiny facts about every single economist being fallible, it gets messy. We understand the original statement without knowing every economist, and are those individual cases of fallibility really basic facts?
Exactly. It shows the difference between logical analysis, where you're making the statement unambiguous, clarifying the relationships, and metaphysical analysis, where you're looking for those, supposed basic facts about reality. Logical analysis is just making things clearer on the same level, while metaphysical analysis wants to reduce things to a deeper level.
And this leads to a big development in analytic philosophy, right? You can use logical analysis to make things clearer, resolve ambiguities, without needing to go all the way with metaphysical analysis and the search for ultimate basic facts. Stebbing herself, the entry says, ended up with a purpose-relative view of analysis. What does that mean?
Her purpose-relative view meant that the right kind of philosophical analysis depends on what you're trying to achieve. There's no one right analysis of a concept or a proposition. The best analysis is the one that helps you the most, for your intellectual or practical goals. For instance, analyzing every economist is fallible logically might help you evaluate arguments about economists, while a psychological analysis might look at the biases that make people fallible. The right analysis depends on what you're using it for.
This more nuanced view of an analysis really shaped how she engaged with another big movement at the time, logical positivism. The entry says Stebbing was super important in bringing logical positivism to Britain, connecting with people like Schlick and Carnap.
Yep, that's right. She was initially drawn to how much logical positivists respected science, their focus on logic being precise, but she really disagreed with them rejecting metaphysics as meaningless. As the entry says, she was down with the logical and the empiricism, but not the full-on positivism.
Right? Her earlier work on metaphysical analysis, the stuff we just talked about, can be seen as an early, subtle challenge to the logical positivist idea that you can just dismiss all metaphysical claims. But her 1933 paper for the British Academy, Logical Positivism and Analysis, that's where she really took them on. One of her big criticisms, I think, was about Carnap's logically constructed systems.
You got it. Stebbing argued that Carnap's idea, the whole thing about building philosophical understanding from pure logic and language, it was too abstract.
Right.
It didn't really deal with the world how we experience it. She didn't think you could just capture reality in these made-up systems.
And showing that she was still influenced by Moore, she rejected Carnap's methodological solipsism.
Yeah.
The idea that we can only be certain about our own experiences by simply saying, I know it to be false. What a, straightforward and strong philosophical stance.
It really is. Maybe not super convincing to someone who believes in solipsism, but it shows how much she believed in the external world and our ability to know things about it. She also had issues with how much the logical positivists emphasized language. She said they were mixing up the direct stuff of our experience with the words we use to talk about it.
The real difference between her and the logical positivists seems to be how they saw philosophical analysis. She preferred directional analysis, while they used postulational analysis, especially for their deductive systems. What was the key difference there?
Exactly. Stebbing saw those logically constructed systems, the ones the positivists loved, as basically replacing our normal ways of thinking with these artificial ones. Her problem with this explicatory analysis, as Carnap called it later, was that it didn't really clarify what we already understood about the world. Instead, it just swapped our familiar, even if sometimes fuzzy, concepts with super precise but ultimately different technical terms.
Her example of using scientific definitions to replace how we normally understand color, defining it by wavelengths, is a good one. She was saying that, the scientific definition is precise, but it misses the whole experience of what it's like to see colors. Same with defining numbers as sets. Does it really help us understand what we mean when we use numbers every day?
Stebbing argued that logical positivists, in their rush to find meaning, were kind of doing things backward. Her view, coming from Moore, was that philosophy should start with stuff we already understand, things we often know to be true. Analysis, to her, was about making that understanding clearer by figuring out what makes those propositions true. She saw logical positivism as making a big mistake, starting with assumptions about language, instead of starting with what we already know about the world.
Her conclusion in that 1933 paper really sums it up. She believed that when people talk unclearly, it's often because they're thinking unclearly. And philosophy's job is to make our thoughts clearer. How? By thinking directly about what we were originally thinking about, by analyzing how we express things so we can say them in a clearer, more precise way. This wasn't just word games for her. It had to be based on what we know to be true. She thought it was fundamentally wrong for logical positivists to try to limit what we can even think about just based on assumptions about language.
Stebbing's critique of logical positivism might have had some, weaknesses, and philosophers have looked at it critically since then. But her efforts to really lay out those different approaches to analysis, her own directional method versus the positivists' postulational one, were super important. She helped create a dialogue between the Cambridge School and the logical positivists, making analytic philosophy more diverse and dynamic.
Oh.
And we're still grappling with the relationship between everyday language and those more formal ways of thinking.
It's interesting how her work then took a turn in the mid-1930s. She started talking to a wider audience, using her understanding of logic to deal with real-world issues.
Right.
This wasn't just abstract philosophy for academics anymore.
You're right. She strongly believed that if you understand how to reason well and use logical analysis, it can help you with all the complicated stuff in everyday life. Her book from 1934, Logic in Practice, that was an early sign of this shift. She started talking more about political speech, giving real examples of bad reasoning from politics and the news.
Then, in 1937, she published Philosophy and the Physicists. Here, she was looking at how scientists, especially the ones who were explaining science to the public, were using language. She was worried that imprecise, sometimes sensationalized language, it wasn't just making scientific findings hard to understand, it was leading to wrong conclusions in other areas of thought, too.
Her criticism of Sir Arthur Eddington is a really good example. She didn't like how he described ordinary stuff, through the lens of physics, especially quantum theory. He was poetic, but she thought it was misleading. His famous statement about a plank of wood having no solidity of substance at the atomic level, she thought that was a dangerous way to use language. Solid, she said, is exactly the word we use to describe planks in our everyday lives. Mixing those two levels of description, she thought it could cause big misunderstandings.
The way she describes just entering a room, focusing on the normal sensory stuff and how reliable everyday objects are, it really makes her point. Ordinary language, she argued, works perfectly fine for describing our normal experiences. We shouldn't just toss it out or undermine it, because science needs different language to explain complicated things. The real danger, as she saw it, was that the kind of language Eddington used, it could be used to draw big conclusions about other parts of human experience, even spiritual or metaphysical stuff, that weren't justified at all.
This worry about rhetoric swaying public opinion became even more important for her when she published Thinking to Some Purpose in 1939. This book was her response to everything going on in politics as World War II was approaching. She felt it was so important for regular people to be good critical thinkers so they could, figure out what was true in political speech and other areas where people try to persuade you.
In Thinking to Some Purpose, she analyzes a bunch of real examples, speeches from politicians like Stanley Baldwin. She shows exactly how choosing certain words can introduce bias, even if you don't notice it, and hide important parts of an argument. The way she breaks down how Baldwin used bias when talking about free trade in favor when he talked about tariffs, it's a great example of this subtle way language can be manipulative.
It is. Through those detailed analyses, she showed how language can shape how we see the world, what we believe, and even what we do, often without us even realizing it. Focusing on the hidden ideology in everyday language, that was really ahead of its time.
Even in her last few years in Cambridge, her work became more and more socially and politically engaged. Even though, personally, she preferred to focus on ideas rather than activism, her 1941 book, Ideals and Illusions, it emphasized how important it is to be able to tell the difference between real ideals and misleading illusions, whether those are political, social, or religious.
Her book, A Modern Elementary Logic, which came out in 1943, was specifically for students, especially those whose education was messed up by the war. And her book that was published after she died, Men and Moral Principles, that was from 1944, it was a defense of reasoned moral debate based on humanism. She really emphasized how important context is when we judge moral issues.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry says that when she died, the obituary is mostly focused on her work on logic and analytic philosophy. And in those areas, she's still influential. She helped bridge the gap between old and new logic, and she helped us understand how Cambridge School developed. But her early critiques of logical positivism and how she brought different thinkers together in the analytic movement, those were also really important parts of what she left behind.
It's amazing to see how her work, looking back, kind of predicted a lot of what happened later in philosophy and linguistics. Her combination of formal logic with the close analysis of everyday language, plus her belief that philosophers should talk about important social and political stuff, that was really unusual and forward-thinking. Her focus on clear thinking and clear language, that really predicted the ordinary language philosophy that came later.
And she actually went further than some of those later philosophers because she always based her arguments on real examples from public discourse. The entry quotes Mary Warnock, who said that Stebbing's focus on language, how it can both cause philosophical problems and help solve them, was really key for how analytic philosophy developed.
And her focus on the hidden social and ideological stuff in language, it connects really strongly with what linguists are doing now, especially in critical discourse analysis, or CDA. CDA's goal is to analyze language to see the hidden ideologies and power dynamics in different texts, like news articles or political speeches. That's very similar to what Stebbing was trying to do, give people the tools to understand and resist persuasive rhetoric. The entry even quotes a modern scholar who points out how similar their goals are, raising awareness about how language can be used to control people or undermine democracy.
So Stebbing wasn't just an ivory tower philosopher. She was all about clear thinking and clear communication, and she really understood how language shapes us, what we perceive, believe, and do. That's valuable stuff, even for us philosophers today. She gives us the tools to analyze information better and to communicate more effectively, both in philosophy and in life.
I agree. When you think about how carefully Stebbing analyzed persuasive language back in the 1930s, with all the political tension going on, it makes you wonder, how would she apply those insights to today's world? The digital age, I mean, with all the information and the carefully crafted stories we see all the time, what illusions would she identify now, in philosophy and in the wider world?
That's a really thought-provoking question. I hope this deep dive has given you a good look into the world of Susan Stebbing. Her philosophy is rich and, surprisingly practical. I encourage you to read her work and think about how her emphasis on clear thinking, analysis, and understanding the power of language can help you make sense of the world.